Yeah, hello. Welcome everybody to this conversation today in our talk series Plattform. My name is Axel Wieder. I'm director of Bergen Kunsthall, and I'm welcoming today two outstanding experts in their field for a conversation. Katja Eyde Jacobsen, a filmmaker and director of the Nordland Art and Film School, and Mike Sperlinger, a writer and director and of the Norwegian initiative PRISMS. And we'll talk about production, reception, and distribution of moving image in the visual arts context in Norway. The talk happens on the last day of our current exhibition, the festival exhibition 2022 by artist and filmmaker Lene Berg, titled Fra Fa. And this event was initially planned to dive into an aspect that is very present in the exhibition, I think, and was very present in making the exhibition. But it's not so explicit on a story or a content level. And that's the exploration of production and presentation models as an artist working with film. And further ongoing the question, are there models for circulation of moving image works between exhibition presentation and mainstream cinema? Film is, generally speaking, a challenging medium for artistic production because it's often expensive and also requires usually a long production rhythm. Not all films, but typically that's a challenge that artists encounter. But then, on the other hand, we see and experience moving image works in exhibitions all across the world, and quite frequently in exhibitions. And that has to do with its qualities as a distributed medium. It can be in several places at the same time, and it's also now, especially in digital formats, easier to ship. And that's also a kind of tension or relationship that we want to explore now. Speaking about artists working in between art and film, internationally this has been, at least since the early 2000s, a quite common phenomenon, and many institutions, one can say, have become almost something like film production houses, or they take this role also on. For me personally, this was very observable in Documenta 11 in 2002, where also filmmakers were entering the art space and film works were produced for an exhibition context. There's now also institutions which really specialize on such activities. The Biennale de l'Image en Mouvement in Geneva, for example, since 2014, is exclusively commissioning works. So all the works that are shown there are commissioned for the exhibition context, and also all happening in an expanded sense of moving image. Yeah, and so on. And then on the other hand, there's also, as I said, for film makers actually entering the art context, and artists moving over to a cinematic context, like entering cinema screens, like Steve McQueen, who made, after being present as an artist for a long time, then also actually producing cinema movies. So within this field, Lene Berg is clearly operating. She has been educated initially as a filmmaker, and she's still producing feature films, but also is operating since a long time in a visual art context. And not lastly to mention, she's also a member of Filmbüro Jack, a project or a company that rethinks distribution, or a distribution community, as it's called on their website. So in a way, we can read Fra Fa, the exhibition downstairs, also as a proposition to think about film, or the question how to make a film as or in space. So we'll discuss on a couple of questions related to this, and also in an expanded sense, talking about other examples to provide a context for a discussion. To introduce our guest today in a bit more thoroughly, Katja Eyde Jacobsen is a film director and graduated at the Norwegian Film School. She realized since then short films and feature films, amongst them Yatzy in 2009. And since 2016, she has been the director of the Norwegian Kunst- og Filmfagskole, or the Nordland Art and Film School in Kabelvåg, an art school specialized on moving image, situated in the Arctic Circle in northern Norway. And in 2017, she helped starting the production collective Alternative together with other filmmakers. So it's also a filmmakers initiative. Mike Sperlinger is a writer and curator, currently professor of writing and theory at KIO in Oslo. And he has written extensively on art and film, including a publication called Occasional Criticism, on how films are affected by the circumstances in which we watch them, and Kino Museum on artist films. He was an assistant director and co-initiator of LUX, a London-based agency for artist moving images, and worked there for more than a decade. And he's now co-initiator and director of the new Norwegian initiative for alternative film culture, PRISMS, which we had an event with you earlier this year, yeah, I think, right. In the end. Yeah, before we come to the conversation, I wanted to mention a few technical remarks. First of all, we are live here, but we also stream this conversation. There are cameras in the space. Please be aware if you are physically here and do not want to relate to the camera. And we talk about 40 minutes maybe, and then we have possibilities for questions afterwards. Yeah. Then we decided to start actually with a bit further exploration of our two guests on their own projects, but starting with a need. You both have worked with initiatives that responded quite clearly to needs in the field of there's the relationship between art and moving image. And I wanted to ask you both to talk a bit more about these projects, maybe starting with Katja and Alternative.
Yeah, I can talk. Maybe it makes sense, thank you, to start with the school, actually, because I was thinking that these two things were born approximately in the same time, but maybe Alternative came later, and maybe it also came a little bit because of the school. Nordland Kunst- og Filmhøgskole in Kabelvåg. Back in 2016, we started a completely new program in the school, and it was actually made, I would say, out of a sort of urgency, as education often mirrors the professional worlds they are tend to serve, or what people are going out into. I would say the school responded to how the film, specifically the field of film, were working. So to maybe change things, you also have to think new about the education. So many artists and filmmakers were involved in creating this new program. And I think it was this discussion specifically between artists and filmmakers, trying to go away from their own educational background and see what can we create that is new, also created a space for artists and filmmakers to start talking together and breaking down the dichotomies of those fields. And Alternative started as as an answer to a sort of need that we had as filmmakers, not being able to have a sort of artistic practice within the field of film, not being able to own the rights to our own works, and how we wanted to change how we produced and acted as filmmakers and producers in this context.
But you have produced a couple of films by now.
Yeah.
Are these? But they're not all of members of the collective.
Mostly we are, but we also produced and work with Marin Horschel, who is an ex-student at the school and made a film called What is a Woman? But we are sort of a structure. We're not really a company. We just have to be a company because that's how the system works. But we are mainly a structure to make filmmakers realize their projects. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. I guess we touch about it later. Okay, so, Mike, do you want to share the reasons for PRISM?
Yeah, I can say very briefly. I should say my project is much less well established than Katja's. It's been going a couple of years, and it's kind of just me at this point, really, and everyone who's engaging with the program. But it's, as you mentioned, my background in London was working for this organisation called Lux, and so Lux describes itself as an agency for artist moving image. Which is deliberately a bit ambiguous, but it's based around a big collection of about 6,000 films and videos by, broadly speaking, artists, which it effectively distributes. It's like a distributor or an agent for those films. But around that, it does a whole range of activities around screenings and exhibitions and publishing and education and so on. And I think I started working in Norway around 2013. I think one of the things that immediately struck me was there is no equivalent organisation to Lux in Norway, in the way that there is, for example, in other European countries. So in Sweden, for example, in Stockholm, there's an organisation called Plattform, which it's slightly smaller scale, but basically archives and distributes primarily Swedish artists' films. And so I just got curious in a way about the histories in Norway and the kind of infrastructure that there was for this kind of practice. And I guess what I found is that there are actually quite a lot of, and there have been historically these initiatives, but there has just never been a kind of organisation to draw those things together. And there have been moments, for example, in the 80s when there were collectives working around Henny Onstad, around video art and so on. But there's never been a kind of artist-run organisation in the way that there was in many other European countries to kind of bring together production, distribution, and exhibition. So PRISMS, in a way, is not really an attempt to replicate that, because I think it's very difficult in 2022 to start a new publicly funded organisation that's that ambitious. It's much more an attempt to start a conversation about the kind of missing parts of the ecosystem in Norway, and to do that primarily through activities around screening. So, as you mentioned, we had a screening here with Andersson, who's here today, in May, down at Landmark. And it's part of a series of screenings called The Deviant Product, which are... The title comes from a remark by this Norwegian filmmaker called Erik Borge, and who in the 60s, he had this kind of wonderful diagnosis of the Norwegian film industry, where he said that there was a problem with Norwegian short films in particular, that they were lacking what he called artistic short films. And he defined artistic short films as deviant products, the strange, the difficult, the angry, which I thought was like a really wonderful way of defining, in a very open way, what an artistic film might be. And so I just wanted to take that proposition and sort of test it now, and to have different guests over a series of screenings, both in Oslo and other cities, respond to that now, like 60 years later, basically. Look, what do they think the deviant products of contemporary moving image culture are that don't find a home in other parts of the kind of film or visual arts world? So that's the starting point. But what I'm really hoping is to use PRISMS as a way, like I say, to join some dots and to maybe start some initiatives between some of the existing organisations and coordinate a bit some of the activities that are definitely already happening, I think.
Yeah, when we talk about needs, it points to challenges in these fields. Yeah, I wanted to ask you again, like, what do you think are the kind of most crucial or urgent challenges, thinking now of artists working with film?
I think it's interesting because when you ask this question, and I was thinking about it, I mean, the first thing you think about is the question of funding. And it is because still, even though technology really changed how it's possible to make and produce moving images, it's still for many projects, important with collaborations and labor, or as you say, time. So moving images is still a kind of expensive, in many situations, it's an expensive medium, so to speak. So I think if you ask many artists, they would say funding is hard because it's hard to get that kind of funding from the arts funding bodies, and it's really hard to get into the film funding bodies. And we could talk about that. We could also talk about like how wrong and how you want to change this. But this is maybe a little bit a boring conversation that we also had a lot of times talking about money and funding, even though it's important.
But I guess it's for artists still also like a production model as learned from film is still maybe unusual. I don't think that this is something that's taught so much in art schools. So I guess like Alternative maybe is also like a way to create a structure in which the question of funding is possible to be addressed, or like a working structure actually towards it. What do you do about?
No, I think this is interesting because we created Alternative, and it has to be able to apply for money from film funding bodies such as the Norwegian Film Institute. You have to be AS, like a company, a formal company. So we created this company, but and by doing it, we also became producers of our own works, but that also means that we could go in dialogue with the Film Institute as all four of us, because as a director with another producer, you can't go in direct dialogue. So it's also a way to sort of go into dialogue with the funding body itself, I would say.
I think that's kind of worth underlining, actually, because I think it's hard in a way if you're not part of this world to know. Yeah. But it's so interesting that, so for example, like historically, as I understand it, because I haven't been producing here, but the Norwegian Film Institute, you couldn't apply for funding. You can't get in the door without a producer. Like the person they want to speak to is a producer. Yeah. Whereas if you kind of think of it in art world terms, it's almost like you can't have a show unless your gallerist is there, and the first person the curator wants to speak to is your gallerist, which is like never the case. You always want to get around the gallerist, right? In a way, you want to speak to the artist. But there's a kind of, I would say, like one of the challenges is this. It overlaps with what you've been talking about, but it's this abyss between the cultures that these institutional cultures haven't caught up with the realities of practice. So this assumption, for example, that to make a film in a film industry setting means to follow a very rigid set of protocols and production processes and roles, where there's a director whose responsibility is this, there's a producer, and so on. And whereas in the visual arts, I would say, like a big part of what it means to be an artist working with moving image is precisely to be challenging the conventions of how you make work in the first place. That's the kind of freedom that you claim by calling yourself an artist. And I think that definitely is one of the institutional challenges in Norway, right? Is the rigidity of the institutional perception of what the roles are and what these terms actually mean to be a filmmaker, to be an artist.
Yeah, maybe we should clarify that quickly. We talked about it in our conversation just before, that maybe it's worth to underline we're using, maybe implicitly and without thinking about it ourselves too much, but I talk about artists working with moving images, so we don't... and this is a different idea than like a film artist, or it basically points to the fact that it's still, we're talking about an artist, and it's not a special type of artist, it's just a different tool or medium. But there are these other implications in such a terminology that you are also very conscious and clear about.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was kind of proposing when we were speaking before, in a way, like having worked for like 20 years with what I would call artist moving image, I'm starting to feel like we should just stop saying artists, because I actually don't know what advantage it brings to kind of keep insisting on the distinction. And I think it's interesting, for example, that I end up doing a project called the Deviant Product, that in a way it's a negative definition. It's not about artists, moving image, or experimental film or anything. It's about things that don't fit these current paradigms. And I think even just the title of L'Alternativa, the alternative, to me has something of the same flavor. It's not about a manifesto for a certain kind of formal practice or medium or anything. It's just about there is something missing. And I guess I think the other example I see more and more the last 3 or 4 years is there's many more festivals and production companies that work with what they call non-fiction, and actually exhibitions as well. Like this huge exhibition in Berlin at the moment that if you're in Berlin in August, you should really try and see, called No Master Territories, which is a huge exhibition about feminist filmmaking, basically, from the 60s to the 90s. Huge, like hundreds of films, incredible amount of research, but the description of them, the way they describe it, is non-fiction. I think 10 years ago it would have been described as artist film or documentary, but I think there's clearly a recognition that these terms are too limiting and they come with too much baggage, especially artists. And I think if you say non-fiction, in a way, it's like, again, it's a negative definition. People have an intuitive feeling of what that means, but it doesn't kind of limit it, and it certainly doesn't, for example, make you feel, as in terms of, as we know, for example, with art institutions, like, this isn't for me. I'm not sure I'm able to cross this threshold. This institution I'm not educated. Non-fiction, I think, is a much more inclusive term, potentially. So I'm being a bit polemical, but I'm actually feeling like increasingly we should be really wary about saying artist moving image, because it just, as Katja was saying earlier, it just easily becomes a genre, as if it's like another category of like animation, artist film, which is just not the case, I think.
No, and also maybe one of the important things and energizing things that is happening, like say in a Norwegian context, I would say, is the fact that people who come more educated from the field of visual arts but make films, or are educated from maybe a film school but still are working with films in a different kind of way than what the industry sets up, are starting to talk together, and suddenly it's not that interesting if you come from this or that, but the more interesting is what we can do together and how we can challenge or create new modes of production or new modes of distribution, new screening settings, to be able to really broaden this field and the dialogue around the field, I think.
Interesting, by the way, with the example from the show that's currently at HKV, because that's, if I remember correctly, mostly historical work, like from the past
it's like
30, 40 years.
90s.
Yeah. So that's actually a classification of an existing body of work, while I guess what the school in Korbelborg has to deal with is more like a look towards the future, like how do artists that or students that are educated nowadays, how do they describe themselves? And I mean, because if I think about the term artist, usually it implies someone willing to or working in a context that we describe as art. So that for me, it doesn't necessarily have to do with an ambition or level of quality. It's more actually a contextual description.
But maybe that's the problem, is like that there's a sense that it's like becomes territorial. It becomes about like, okay, you're an artist, so your natural platform for showing is here, rather than, for example, a sense that an audience that's interested in the topic you're working with might be interested regardless of whether they're interested in visual art, for example, or I'm just thinking even, for example, like the artist Mark Leckey, who's sort of known, kind of British Turner Prize winning artist who's worked a lot with video, and he set up his own art school last year in the UK, a contemporary art school, and deliberately didn't use the word art. They just talked about film and music, just because that somehow, there was no sense of like everyone's got a relationship to film and music in a way. There's some intuitively, I think there's not that sense. There's less, at least, of the sense of not knowing enough to have an opinion or not being qualified or not. And I just thought that's a kind of interesting straw in the wind, I think, that decision by someone who's absolutely only known for working with the context of art, actually choosing to say, in this moment, I choose not to say art.
Yeah. But let's go back to distribution. Because that seems to be like a second challenge, like while production or financing actually is one challenge, so is distribution, like how to get works that are potentially entering other contexts, how to get them actually there. And you mentioned the Venn diagram of different areas, production, distribution, exhibition, but what do you think is needed there? What are artists struggling with, or what is with Lux maybe more than with Prisms? What are you kind of tackling there or addressing?
I think, it's a big question. I think a couple of things. I think one thing is, and this is something Katja mentioned actually before, just before we came on, was access, right? Like that in a kind of streaming culture, if you're interested in cinema, these days it's relatively easy to see at least many more things than it was even 10 years ago. And not necessarily to screen it. Like if you screen it in a cinema, you have to go and get the rights and so on. But just to watch it, just to know what this film is, what this Sukharov film is, or whatever, what this Indian, classic piece of Indian cinema from the 60s is. But in the visual arts, there's a scarcity model still, and it's just incredibly hard. There are these very big names of artists, historical artists, film like Stan Brakhage, to name an obvious example, someone like a experimental filmmaker in America from the 60s, 70s, 80s. And how would you see that work? I mean, now there's been a Blu-ray published of his, but it's like you can't go to Mubi, you can't... so I think distribution in one thing is about the secondary access. I think this idea of just availability, so that people know what the things are, like almost like an art historical reproduction, like a photo of a painting. That sense of just knowing what work is. But I think the second thing is just when it comes to distribution, in terms of the sense that we're more familiar with it from, of films reaching a public, I think what's complicated is again, these kind of overlapping and somewhat contradictory infrastructure for cinema and the visual arts. So just a very obvious example at Lux is that Lux, as a distributor, sent films out to any kind of situation you can imagine, from a small student screening club to a film festival, to an art house cinema, to biennials, to museums that were installing works on display for 2 months and so on, like the whole spectrum. But the kind of conversation you have to have with each of those organizations is different, and their level of budget is very different. Their expectations of what kinds of materials you supply is different. And often you end up in direct culture clashes between them. So just the obvious example being film festivals are still obsessed with premiere status. So many film festivals define themselves by saying, we are showing this film for the first time in Europe, for example. When you're a visual artist, your production, like Lene is here, for example, is probably funded by an arts institution, like in a particular city. And you're not going to hold that piece back for your film to have one screening in another country. But the festivals don't, traditionally anyway, didn't understand that. So you'd have these very strange conversations where they'd be insisting they couldn't show something at all because it had been exhibited by the place that commissioned it in another country. And so which to me, just in 2022 again, just seems just increasingly absurd, that these value systems are so rigid and that we're unable to... and I think that's something that artists, like we talked about with production, but that's something that artists are always caught in the middle of, I think, are these sort of, not just economic systems, but value systems.
Yeah, which are they're closely linked as well, value to the economy.
Absolutely.
Mean, and it's to go back to that. I mean, the distribution in cinemas or classical cinemas is so linked to funding of production. So, like, say you get funding from a film funding body, which Lene, for instance, did for her last project, False Belief. Then you have to show it in a cinema because that's the film's value, so to speak. It's given. Whereas if you are funded from a different kind of funding body, the Arts Council, it can be very difficult to get if it is a film, to get it in a cinema at all. So I think it's very, it's something it's clashing completely, because sometimes it could be interesting to see something in the cinema who was not produced as a film. But Lene did an interesting project with False Belief, where she did go around and made a report about it, screening her film in very many small local cinemas and making conversations around the film, which was like an interesting project, and also one of the things that eventually would lead to Jack as the distribution network.
I mean, the obvious question is like, in which kind of places do these screenings, events take place? Because there are cinemas, but then cinemas have also changed significantly over the past decades, addressing a different audience or providing films of a more international screening circuit, more like mainstream. Like, what kind of spaces do exist between, like, say, massive commercial cinemas and really art institutions organizing screenings in half-fitting spaces?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it's a broad question as well, but it's what exists and what might be. I mean, you have a clear distinction, I think, in cinemas also, because you still have some cinemas that are not private, that are owned, that are different rooms than like the huge cinemas that you would have in bigger cities. You still have some film clubs, for instance, and this is one. And you have galleries that are getting extensively involved in and interested in screening of films. In Oslo, we also have the Kunstnernes Hus Kino, where Kunstnernes Hus actually built a cinema that looks different from another cinema, just by how the way we are seated. For instance, in that cinema, you don't sit in each individual seat, but you are like, and it kind of changes the whole, even though it is a cinema. And we have Vega Scena, but also many several small initiatives that make an event from a screening or curate film programs, like Herfra, who is a English. It's a collective of curators who curate film programs, for instance, which is interesting, and it's nomadic. And I was thinking about Knut Aastam's, do you remember, as also mobile egress? Where he had this truck where he built a screening room inside the truck, and the truck was moving around in different spaces.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. And I think, in a way, I would say, like, another way to think about this definition, actually, of the difference between what we're calling artist film and cinema, then if we want to hold that distinction, would be actually maybe that it's not actually what is shown, but how it's shown as much. So, for example, even with Lene, like the example of like showing a film that is a feature film, but traveling with it, contextualizing the same way that Knut did, like actually making the space for it and being there to discuss with the audience. And I think what you've seen is the as you were saying, Katja, like the consolidation of the cinema industry, like we have less and less independent cinemas internationally, less art house spaces, but there is, especially in the last 5 years, there's been a huge mushrooming of these smaller screening initiatives, some of which are like micro cinemas, they would call themselves. And there was a really amazing event, which again you can see documentation of online, but in Berlin in June, called Cinema of Commoning, where they had like a kind of meeting of all of these micro cinemas internationally to talk about this sort of new wave of organizations. But actually also these like nomadic screening organizations, so like Heck, and but I think many others. And actually I'm in dialogue at the moment with Terrassen, which is a group in Copenhagen whose tagline is the social life of film, and again they screen in very different places, but the emphasis is on context, on the conversation that happens around the film as much as the film. And I think that is something where there's kind of a huge amount of energy, but it's all very much at a grassroots level in a way. And so the connections are only starting to happen, I think, between these kind of micro initiatives. But I think that, to me, is where the exciting stuff is happening, because it's that culturally is the big difference between these fields. Like the cinema idea of distribution is indifference, right? That it's about the idea that you should have the same experience of Top Gun Maverick or whatever, like regardless of the place you see it. Like it might be a bigger or smaller screen maybe, but the product is standardized. It's not whereas actually I think all of the energy and exciting stuff around this kind of artist practice is about the idea that it's an event, it's a performance. Even if you're just watching videos, it's like and that's what I think is kind of exciting in terms of contemporary developments there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's also interesting what you say, especially with the notion of a nomadic space, because it shifts so clearly the emphasis from, I guess, like an optimized technical space to a social space, where, it's much more about the encounter or the discussion or the discourse. Which also maybe shifts an idea of like what we understand as this kind of like film experience, that it is more about content and a discussion and not about the perfect playback of audiovisual material also.
Maybe this has been or become increasingly important also because we have this growing digital culture where we can, consume all these images all the time through our computers in our homes. I mean, then the reason for why should we watch this film or why should we watch this work together? It's a very important question. Why would I go somewhere and watch this work with somebody? And then maybe the answer is, the reason why I also think there's a lot of energy in this, having conversations, making it as an event, making it as something that happens there and then. It's both that and also this broadening the film's room in the maybe because we lack a sort of public conversation or critical aspect around film culture today. So this having this sort of conversations really makes but broadens the film culture, maybe make it more relevant than it has been.
Yeah, you mentioned this fact around critical culture around films, that there's not really a review system also in place.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of, again, it's one of these gaps where if you have a film on general release in Norway or anywhere else, basically it will get reviewed in most national newspapers. It's a kind of standard thing and the national broadcaster will cover it and so on. And if you have an exhibition like Lene's, I mean, hopefully at least the local press will cover it, and there'll be a sense of like it's an exhibition that people can go and see. If you do a screening or a more curated event that's a one-off, it's very hard. There's no critical culture around that. It's very difficult to get platforms to write about things that people will not be able to go and see, even though, for example, in other contexts there's a recognition that's important. So think about like music festivals you'll get reviews of, or like a big opera production that happens for 2 nights, that will get reviewed because there's a kind of convention that it's important somehow for it to be discussed, even if not your readership can't have the chance to see it. But I think that's really missing. We just haven't got this very vibrant critical culture that thinks about writing about contextualizing and writing critically about events, films as events. I think that would be that would be exciting if we had more of that.
I want to go back a bit to the exhibition and the format, because now we discussed basically similar cinema and distribution and smaller kind of social screening spaces, but we were wondering what is the exhibition space and the display formats that they offer. What does this add to the kind of system of watching film? And maybe like also this has been a point that we really very specifically thought about when making the exhibition with Lene Berg, that also because we were working on the project for such a long time and we had all possibilities to think about this question: how do people entering the show relate to it, to get around the point of like showing a film that people watch from a fixed position, like just screening a film in the exhibition space, which is maybe the most common idea of a film installation, turning the exhibition space into a temporary cinema. So this was a chance to, on the one hand, think about filmmaking and incorporating elements of the filmmaking process that are usually not visible in a film, but also to give viewers a different experience where they actually wander through spaces and experience spaces in a film-like narrative, but with themselves as pacemakers and as co-directors or so. Yeah, where do you see the exhibition space coming in to kind of other ideas of seeing film?
But maybe it's interesting to talk. I think it's very interesting to talk about Lene's work in this context. I mean, first of all, I mean it's a really inspiring work, both in the way it works thematically and everything, but also how it actually discusses what film is, what it can be. In a way, it is a film or it is a narrative, but completely unfolded, and it also have the space and the room for these things that the film cannot hold, which I find really interesting in this work specifically. So it raises a lot of questions and thoughts around exactly how film can be expanded if you think about it in different ways. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think I love the show, and I think there's a lot about the show has all these different ways of kind of framing the impossibility of this being a feature film. You know, I think it has these different ways of kind of expressing that from, so like you said, in the first room you come in, there's a bench and there's a sense of like, okay, this is a bit more of a conventional situation where we're going to sit for 13 minutes and watch this film from beginning to end maybe. But by the time you get to the last room and there's like a telephone where only one person at a time is able to do that. So it really, it's forcing you, and you're quite self-conscious in that situation. It's not the kind of anonymity of being in the dark with a group of people. You have to sit and visibly be on the phone to the, and in the same room you're having these kind of unresolved casting sessions for her father, which is kind of in itself fascinating, but also in a sense, you know, there's something about the complete impossibility of ever resolving on one of these people who could fully stand in and be the father in a narrative feature film. And then, of course, his own film prints rendered invisible in quite a violent way, I think. You know, they're very, very beautiful, these kind of sea anemones of 35mm prints. But I think this show really thematizes that. But I guess the other, like another polar opposite would be something like the show, sorry to mention the show that people probably haven't seen, but the show in Berlin, this big archival show, at the Haus der Kultur in der Welt, where there's maybe, I don't know, 40 or 50 screens and projections in one room, and you have like a Bluetooth headset, and it's like an archive. It's basically like going to an archive and choosing your own pathway through the archive. And actually, I think in that case, it really worked. That's something that you could never do in a film season, for example, at the Cinematheque. You know, if you show that 100 films, realistically, you know, one every night of the week, I'm going to see 5 of them. I'm not, you know, but the chance to actually just have this incredibly dense kind of spatial and temporal experience of film is something that exhibitions can also do, I think, in terms of reframing existing film material. So I think there are many possibilities.
You have this, it's this feeling, I relate to it personally as well, because sometimes you work with a project and you see there are just too many things to be able to fit into one project or one film. Let's say you work with lots of, like I work with lots of archival material or whatever, and you just feel this need to expand the film, because the film is narrow in a way, or in its form. And I see also my students, when they are given like, you have to find out how you want to show your work. I mean, it's not given. It's not, you have to find out yourself. And they're often, I see they often drawn to the idea or when they screen their things that they want to be in a space that can be more than just a screening, if you know what I mean. Where the space itself is important. They want to expand how you experience the screen. where the space is really important and the context is important, and that's why Lene's work is so inspiring, I would say. Mm-hmm.
Should we maybe open to questions if... we need to actually use the microphone for the streaming and the...
Hi. If you didn't have to worry about funding, what kind of things would you like to incorporate into the things that you distribute or make?
Was that the question for me or for both of us?
I think it's more for you.
No, that's a very hard question. No, I think actually I think what we do in Alternativa is saying that if we want to make a project, we're going to make it regardless. I mean, we're going to apply for the funding, and sometimes it's hard and we spend a lot of time on administration, but if we decide that we're going to do this project, we're going to do this project on the terms of the artist who is doing it. And if we don't have funding, we have to find other ways of realizing that project with the human resources that we have, you see. So I think the most important that the work should be realized in the way that it's right for the project. And when it comes to, and the same way I think around distribution, that the work should be shown in the way that's right for that project specifically.
But I think one about that, like one thing would be, from my point of view, I'm not so involved in production, but screening should be free.
Yes.
You know, so for example, it's always been crazy to me that you go to somewhere like the ICA in London, the Institute of Contemporary Arts, and if you turn right, you go into the gallery space, and you maybe have to pay £1. I mean, I'm out of date, maybe it's changed, but if you go left into the cinema, you're going to pay £10 or £15 to see something that you probably know very little about. It hasn't been, you know, and your expectations are immediately very different. So it's like I think just lowering that threshold of like not getting people at that consumer mentality of going to the cinema in order to have certain kinds of experience would be great.
That's a very good point. Mm-hmm.
The sad thing, though, is that probably the ticket prices relate to what people are actually willing to pay. Right? So, in general, I guess there's an expectation that exhibitions are free, while people are not doubting to pay a huge admission to a film.
Possibly, although I guess it depends on the place. But like a big museum show will definitely cost you like 150 kroner or whatever, or like it's not so different from a cinema ticket, I think. But it's more unusual to have free screenings than to have free museum entries, right? Like I think in certain times and places, free museum or free gallery entry is quite normal.
Yeah,
but it's very rare to have screenings, I think, that are free.
Hi, thank you all for a very interesting talk. My question is probably mostly to Katja. How do the students relate to this dichotomy between artist or filmmaker? Because I guess Kabelvåg is very much about kind of dissolving the boundaries between the two, and it's kind of a playroom of experimentation, but then you sort of come out afterwards and have to sort of find avenues or distribution places for your work. And
it's a very interesting question, actually, and because this field is sort of relatively new, at least in the national context. It's like they also. First of all, we're very happy to have. That's also a motive for starting the school, getting colleagues, more colleagues. But I think they also have had to sort of be ambassadors or creating the field that they go into. So you see because we tell them that you are individual artists, but you are and you have to take responsibility for the whole production process and the whole your whole work, the way you do it, but how you work and how you produce and who you work with, I mean, that's not given at all. You have to find out. So we see very, very different. Some students come out and work more into the field of visual art, but then also some are doing both. I mean, like Marin's film that I mentioned earlier, it's a short film. But I think it was the most shown film on like Aftenposten TV or something, and it won an Amanda Prize. But it also has been shown on Tate and in lots of other contexts. So maybe they feel more free to operate in both fields, which I think is a strength. If that answers your question.
Hello, thank you very much for this very interesting talk. I was more curious about the audiences, because you have spoken largely about production and distribution, but like, who are actually the audiences of the works distributed, in your view?
Wow, that's hard to answer. I mean, I think it. I think it's as much. It's like it comes to that distribution question again. That it's when things reach you, it's always through an institution. So it tends to be the institution's audience partly. Like, so especially with art, I think that's really the case. But I think it's actually very broad. I think the reason that maybe I'm polemically saying, for example, not to talk so much about artists' film, is because I feel like that becomes a form of self-selection for the audience. That it's like, I'm interested in art, therefore I'm... Whereas actually, I think a lot of the works, including Lene's, I mean, is really a very broad interest, not to people who are specifically interested in even the visual arts. I think we're so used to... compared even to when I was growing up, moving image culture is at your fingertips all the time. Everybody has a relationship to moving images, I think, to video and film. And probably making it, they might not think of it in those terms, but you're shooting video. So I think the potential audience is huge, and I think that's in a way why. But I think the thing that's maybe important about artist work is that it doesn't fit well into being on these big platforms, like the kind of Netflix, Amazon type platforms, where there's no context. I think maybe this is another way of defining this activity. It's quite context dependent. So it's like when Lene presents the work and is there to do a Q&A, or even online on a website like Another Gaze, for example, which is a really fantastic feminist film website. And they show works, but they show one or two works at a time, and they commission an essay around it, and so everything's a bit framed. You have a sense of where and when is this from, and whereas we're used to going to consuming films in a much more decontextualized way. And so I think that's maybe that's what the bridge to big audiences is, this bigger sensitivity to how films are contextualized.
Sort of like when we're thinking about like difference between like institutional context and these sort of act as gatekeepers, while where you're speaking now like more like online platforms and so on, you're able to reach more like sort of diverse audiences, or like
possibly. I guess it's always the question of like how people find their way. There's always some, even to get to an online platform, if it's a small one, you've had to find your way there. There has to be it has to be aggregated somehow. So I guess that's why I think these kind of initiatives that are about signposting are as important as anything else. That's what I think Lux, for example, has invested a lot of time in not just doing distribution, for example, but in publishing and doing education and seminars, and you know what I mean. So because I think that's essential, basically, to reach an audience. I think it's there's kind of no other way for this kind of work. It's never going to benefit really from the long tail effects of commercial cinema that you get on the big platforms. It needs something much more proactive, I think.
But so it's interesting, the question of audience. I was also thinking about actually going back to Lene, because there is an audience who maybe would not come into to a gallery, but like Lene's false belief. they would think it's an artist film or whatever, but it's not. It's not a film that is not very relevant and actual for a broader audience. So I was there when she showed it in Svolvær Kino, which is a very small cinema, and she had a conversation with the character D in the film afterwards, and the people who were there, I think they would maybe not have come if it was a gallery, but they came because it was in a sort of cinema context, and it really moved them, you know, and because the conversation was there afterwards, they continue, like you were saying, like make it, it opens up the film, and it was something that they were discussing a lot, and I think that's just interesting, that the way a film can be presented in many different ways, it doesn't need, the one doesn't think has to exclude the other, in a way, also to broaden the audience. Mm-hmm.
But maybe we keep it there. And thank you very much for joining today. Thank you for questions and joining the conversation. Thank you, everybody online.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.